Hey everybody, welcome back to another Vox University. You guys didn't think you'd get it twice in 1 year, but in a pandemic, apparently you do, because we're doing some more virtual stuff. So welcome back to some Advent teaching on Vox University. These are going to be a little bit more different. Not only are these being posted on YouTube, just like the last ones were, but also we are going to be doing a live discussion on Zoom on these. So if you are watching this now with future Levi, thanks for tuning in with him. I hope he is as enjoyable as I will be tonight. I guess. Word stumble, but it's all right. So we are going to be doing some Advent teaching. The goal of these, unlike normal Vox Universities that are like 30 to 45 minutes, these are going to be like really short and condensed. We're looking for like 10, maybe 15 at most, but hopefully just like 10 minutes or so of teaching time and a little bit of discussion on Zoom. So thank you guys for joining me. So we're going to dive right into it. This series, we're going to be doing 3 or 4 weeks of these, is to look at specific people or characters or places or historical context for the first Christmas story, the very first Advent season. And so the goal of this is two-part. Number one is just to understand Christmas a little bit better. I love looking at things through the lens of history. Hopefully you guys do too. If you are taking time out of your day to watch this, I can only assume that you at least enjoy it enough to patronize the thoughts or patronize me. Either or is good. So we're going to be looking at things and hopefully learning a little bit about the original Christmas. The second thing is hopefully just to kind of like give us a little bit of a refresh. If you're like me, you grew up in the church, which means you've heard the Christmas story and the Nativity story about 100 different times in 100 different ways, from movies to felt boards to sermons to youth sermons to kids sermons to all kinds of different ideas. And because of that, there's this certain familiarity that breeds, like, not necessarily like rejection of it, but just simply pure acceptance, and we lose some of the magic and wonder of it. So I'm hoping that we can recapture a little bit by learning something new that we may not have known, or to correct some of our poor assumptions that came about just simply from being familiar and assuming we knew everything about it. So let's begin with one character that I think is super important to the Nativity story. We're going to be looking at him today, and that is the character of Joseph. Let's get him up on the whiteboard. Today we are going to be looking at 3 specific things about Joseph. So let's begin with the very first one. I'm pulling these colors out at random. I hope everyone can see them on the screen. If you're watching this on Zoom, feel free just to say, hey, pause, and we'll pause the video and we'll talk a little bit. Otherwise, you can put comments down below and we'll try to answer those in a timely manner if you're not able to watch it on the Zoom call. So the first thing that we want to learn about Joseph is his job. Not quite Job, but his job. We all know that Joseph was a carpenter, and I just realized that I might be writing too far off screen. Can everybody see the words? Okay, awesome. No, we're just going to put carp right there to make sure everything fits. Joseph wasn't a fish. He was not a carp, but he was a carpenter. And if you are like me, growing up, you assumed that meant that Joseph worked with wood. That's what like carpenters do, right? They work with wood. Well, that's not necessarily true. You see, wood at this time in first century Judaism is a very precious resource, especially if you live in Israel, because if it's wood, it's likely a tree, and if it's a tree, it's likely producing fruit like figs and olives. So the idea of someone whose whole job is to work with wood, you're not going to have a lot of work very often, because it's much better to have those trees producing fruit than to have the woods for units of lumber. Instead, a carpenter is more like, almost like a contractor. What a carpenter would do is not only could they work with all kinds of material from stones to, yes, wood, where later he would become specialized in wood as centuries would continue, but the goal of a carpenter was kind of a catch-all for all versions of material building. But even more than that, it's the person you would hire as like a contractor if you wanted to build a building. They would be in charge of building buildings. And so we actually see this quite a bit in the life of Joseph, but then more importantly, we actually see Jesus reference this. Because one of the things that I feel like we forget about Joseph is that Joseph was the father of Jesus. He was Jesus' dad while on earth. Like we get so focused on the relationship of Jesus and Mary, there are times that we kind of forget about Joseph because he also disappears pretty quickly from the gospel stories. And so we want to look a little bit at the specific times that Joseph and his job as a carpenter affected Jesus. We see it because, number one, we see how it affected him in like what Jesus did. If you were a carpenter, it meant that you did 2 things a lot. Number one, it meant that you traveled. And traveling is not something that a normal person would do. Traveling is dangerous. Traveling is not needed. Traveling is not a necessity. People didn't travel very much. A carpenter, however, would go where buildings needed to be built. And so Joseph was a traveler. And Jesus later would also be a traveler. He would have traveled with his dad and learned how to travel. The other thing that you would do as a carpenter is you were in charge of building a team to build your building. So not only would you travel, you would recruit, hire, and finish a project, and that's very much what Jesus did with his disciples. He traveled and recruited teams, skills that he would have learned from his dad. More than that, though, we actually see the specific idea of Joseph being a carpenter twice in Jesus' parables. Number one, there's the famous parable of building your house on a firm foundation, and a foolish man builds on sand. And where would Jesus have learned about good and bad foundations? From Joseph. It's what he would have seen growing up. It's his household. It's what his dad did. He's playing off of his household knowledge. The other thing is kind of a beautiful moment when the disciples ask Jesus to stay with them, and Jesus says that he's going to prepare a better place for them, a place in his Father's house. And this is, once again, a great kind of rabbi joke because he's getting a 2-for-1. He's making a joke about it's his Father's house, it's his heavenly Father, but he's referring to his earthly father's skill set of building houses. He's talking about both of his fathers in this moment with his disciples. And so in first century Judaism, if you were wanting to build onto your house, you would have hired a carpenter to help you build and make sure that the foundations were set to build that house. So the first thing that we want to remember about Joseph is his profession. He was a carpenter. But there's more that we want to learn. You know what? We're not going to use that color again since we got Joseph up there with that. The second thing we want to learn, we're going to leave this middle space for our major information, is what Joseph was called. And I'm just going to put right up here, because the gospel text, one of the few things that we get as a description of Joseph in them, is that Joseph was a righteous man. Now, if you're an American like me and you hear that someone is righteous, you probably think that maybe they're holy. And if you're thinking about them in terms to their job, it would certainly mean that they're like an ethical business. They're who you want to hire. They're good. They do their work on time. They charge fair prices. You want a righteous mechanic to work on your car, right? Or on your car. You want to make sure that what they're doing is actually needed and that you're getting a fair price for it. And that is very true. I would like that to be said. That's very true. That is something that righteous is. However, righteous in this century is oftentimes something that is bestowed upon you, not something that you can claim. Claiming that Joseph is a righteous man would be like in businesses when they're like established in 1665. And we're still working today all these decades later. It's a term of trust. It's given by the community to the person. But the thing that is most important to remember in the case of Joseph is that righteousness is given to people at a proper age. When we think about Joseph, one of the things that is oftentimes wondered is how old is Joseph? And if you were in first century Judaism reading the text, you would know immediately because Joseph is righteous. It is a term of age that is given to someone. A young man cannot claim to be righteous because they have not lived enough of their life to be judged by the community that they are in on if they are righteous or not. Even in the Old Testament, Moses is not referred to as righteous until very late in age, and he's Moses. He's like a big deal. And so the idea that Joseph is called righteous is very important to understanding who Joseph is. Because not only is he good and moral and ethical, but it means that Joseph is likely at least 40. Now Mary would have been upper teens or early 20s, most likely, but Joseph is likely in his 40s or higher, which begs the question of why. Why is Joseph who is marrying Mary? And we're going to talk about that here in our final category here. The last thing that we want to talk about with Joseph is this, and I'm just going to kind of draw down of where did Joseph go? Joseph is in so little of the gospel other than the nativity story. We get one final small moment with him trying to find young Jesus in Jerusalem, but then Joseph is gone. And Mary remains. And Mary has multiple encounters with Jesus throughout the rest of her life. And it gets even more confusing because it talks about Jesus' brothers also came and talked to Jesus in multiples of the Gospels. And then James claims to be a brother of Jesus. Like, what is going on with Joseph, and where did Joseph go? And if you're a Protestant, like we are, our answer is pretty simple. We're going to put Protestants. They say this, and that Joseph, he just died. How? We don't know. Why? We don't know. Probably old age. Joseph died. The end. We're going to move on. And that's a little lackluster, is it not? If you're like me, you're still wondering, where did he go? Like, if he died, like, why did a 40-year-old righteous man marry a young teen? And if we dig deeper, we actually find something much more interesting from our Catholic brothers and sisters. Our Catholic brothers and sisters say this, that Joseph died. But they actually have a good reasoning behind this. And so even though both are the same, Catholics actually have a much bigger thought. The idea is that Joseph is a righteous man, but more importantly, that Joseph was already married. That Joseph had been married once before, had lived a life, and more importantly, had kids. And that Joseph already had a family. Until one day, we don't know how, it's not included in the text in any way, Joseph's first wife died. And thinking about the life expectancy, if you're in your 40s and you're called righteous, your wife probably is going to die. Life expectancy is around the age of 60 if you have some money to help get you there. And so the idea is that Joseph's first wife died and left Joseph with some kids. And so what age the kids are, we don't know, but Joseph took his kids and wanted to make sure his kids were taken care of in the event that Joseph would die. And so the question then becomes, why does this matter? Why is this idea important? And more importantly, is there any other evidence that supports that? And the answer is absolutely yes, because in multiple Gospels, in both Mark and Luke, the brothers of Jesus come and confront Jesus because they're upset that Jesus is traveling. And more importantly, Jesus is traveling, leaving Mary at home with them. So let's draw a quick diagram real quick. Let's think about this. So we have Joseph. We're going to draw him in green right here. So there's Joseph, and Joseph marries Mary. And the idea is Joseph already had some kids. We have no idea how many, so we're just going to draw two real quick. But then Mary has baby Jesus. In this time, in first century Judaism, if dad was gone, it is up to the youngest child to take care of mom. Regardless of biological, the youngest male would take care of mom. And so the other children are upset because Jesus is not doing what he is supposed to do for their mom. He's not staying home. Instead, Jesus is the one who goes off and travels. And we see this even more when we see Jesus on the cross. What is one of the very last things Jesus does is Jesus gives Mary to the disciple John, thus taking care and making sure someone can take care of mom. Because in the event that the youngest was unable to take care of them, instead of giving them to the oldest child, it was their job to find another person to take care of their mom. And so why is this ultimately important? I believe it's because it paints a broader picture of the original story and the family that Jesus was born into. The idea that Jesus wasn't the oldest, shirking off responsibilities and ignoring his mom, but rather was in his right to do so, and then also gives Mary to another man when he's on the cross to take care of him, gives him to John to take care of them. So the conclusion about where did Joseph go is that he did die of old age. And maybe if you're like me, this is very fascinating to you. Like, this probably won't ultimately change how we view Jesus, but I think it does give us a better glimpse into the life that Jesus had growing up, being the youngest child. If you have multiple kids, you know that the youngest might be a little different. And so painting with colors is always the goal of these Vox universities. So I hope this is at least a little bit helpful for thinking more about Joseph and why is Joseph in the story and how did Joseph affect Jesus? How old was Joseph? And more importantly, where did Joseph go. So thank you guys for tuning in with me. If you're on Zoom call right now, I'm going to pass you off to Future Levi, wherever he's at, to continue this discussion with you. Regardless, I hope you guys have a great time this Advent series in 2020. Thanks for tuning in.